At this time, I'd like to give the amazing introduction. Alberta Moore lives in the Leimert Park community with the Crenshaw District of Los Angeles, California, with her husband and 3 children. They are a proud third-generation Los Angeles Unified School District family. Currently, Alberta is an engaged student, parent, and community advocate. Alberta graduated from Loyola Marymount University in 1984 with a BA in Urban Studies, a minor in Business Management. She earned a Master of Arts in Behavioral Science, Negotiation, and Conflict Management from California State Dominguez Hills. Alberta retired from a national automobile insurance company after 28 years of working in claims, suit negotiations, and on the national disaster team. Currently, she is on the board of directors for the Randall Simmons Outreach Foundation. Alberta is a founding member of the African American Alumni Association at Loyola Marymount University. She is the current LMU AAAA president. Alberta, the former student body president, has been an engaged LMU alumni since 1984, serving on several university-wide alumni boards. Alberta also serves on the South Central Los Angeles Regional Center Self-Determination Advisory Community. Alberta is an LAUSD parent that advocates for students and families, in addition to being part of Speak Up's African American Parent Advocacy Team. Alberta started a blog and Facebook group, Black Americans Understanding the Real Cost of College, a college prep village engagement scholarship information site. Alberta started her engagement with the CRSSLA on the education community to address the staggering numbers of students not signing in for online learning. Without further ado, I want everyone to give a virtual round of applause to Miss Alberta Moore.
Welcome, everyone. And in between the breaks, I went and made breakfast for the family. So you know you have to multitask, do it all. But I welcome you because I know you're putting time away from your families to be here and engage with us this morning. And we're just going to jump right in. Last session, I realized we don't have a lot of time. Each one of these sessions can be a seminar on its own. So we're going to have each person introduce themselves. We're going to start with Mr. Harris.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Dejon Harris. I am a site director at New Earth Arts and Leadership Center. Not sure, Alberta, how much you'd like me to share, but yeah, that's me. I have a undergraduate and graduate degree from USC. My graduate degree was in social work, so I have a MSW background. Played college and professional athletics for some time, so yeah, it's me.
And next, we're going to have Mr. Johnson. Okay, well, next we'll go to Mr. Person-Lynn.
Hi, good morning. And you know, it's actually afternoon where I'm at. I'm on the East Coast at the moment, even though I live in Los Angeles. Born and raised, but I did actually get educated on the East Coast at Hampton University, undergrad, my law degree from Howard University School of Law. I'm here in DC now for a fundraiser. I'm an abolitionist, meaning I try to abolish the system that has historically been oppressive to my people. I make my money as a criminal defense attorney. That's my day job. And I'm just happy to be here representing, like I said, from LA, went to Westchester High School, and just happy to be connected and sharing my experiences with you all in this wonderful panel.
Next, we will go with Mr. Jones.
Well, how you guys doing? I'm Marquis Jones. I'm an assistant principal at Boys Academic Leadership Academy, which is LAUSD's first all-male male school. I went to, most of my colleges are Cal State Northridge for undergrad. Then I went to national universities for one master's degree. Then I also went to Dominguez for another master's degree. And then I also played college football and track, and I ran professional track for a while. And I also was a police officer at one point in my life. So kind of come from that angle too. I worked actually in the neighborhood that I grew up in South Central as a police officer. And then all of my schools have been in the neighborhood that I grew up in as well. So I like to work with boys that grew up how I grew up and kind of give them different options of what they can do. So very glad to be here and share some information with you guys.
I would like to thank everyone for those wonderful introductions, because it gives everyone more ideas about what you do. So when they contact you later for additional assistance, they know precisely who they're calling. So we're gonna start with the basics. What do you mean when you refer to unfair biases and labels? Anyone want to start us off?
I can start off with that. One thing that I do know is, like I said, in the schools that I work in South Central, just the way that some of our young men, I'll just start off with young men because that's what I mostly work with. Our young men are dressed, they automatically unfairly get biases toward them about how they're gonna act, how they're gonna be, what kind of intelligence that they have. But some kids dress a certain way because it may be inexpensive, or it may be a way to fit in their neighborhood or their environment. So it doesn't necessarily how you look, even though, they say how you dress is how you get addressed. That doesn't always account for young men until they get taught that. So if they're wearing the clothes that their parents bought or the ones that they feel like look cool because their friends are wearing them, that doesn't necessarily say who they are and how their intelligence is going to be. So I think a lot of times teachers do their first from eye shot, when they see them, they automatically judge them as this kid's going to be a troublemaker or whatever. They start treating them that way. So I think that's one thing.
Yeah, and that's definitely how unfair bias, especially towards Black boys and men in education, is manifested. And unfair bias manifests itself in many ways, pretty much what Mr. Jones just described. Wherever that situation happens, and it happens across the board, even walking through a grocery store, you may end up being followed because they judged you as a criminal based on the way you look. And the main characteristic of the way you look is your skin color and your facial features and your hair. And that's the greatest unfair bias in my experience. Being a Black man and Black male in the United States, is that you are a criminal to start, or your intentions are bad to start. And then, there's just other unfair biases that we have on a smaller scale, right? Like, and these biases are based off of experiences. That's what we have to understand, how they get to be biases. People have either been taught this or experienced these things. And so that's unique, right? But when it comes to Black people, this society teaches through its literature, through its words, through its experiences, that Black men are violent and need to be treated as such.
And just piggybacking off that, I don't know, when you look at the bias, right, you think about the way that this country's historical background hinges upon the idea that, Black people are inferior to, or to be made inferior to white people, right? The skin color bias emerges as a norm. These biases were established, to maintain profit-bearing class distinctions, which essentially were monetarily beneficial to ruling, white elite class, you know what I mean? And more socially appealing to middle or lower class communities. These biases are rooted in race and class. and have now become like a systemic as a natural norm. So, you know, it's, yeah, just adding my 2 cents to it. But.
And that takes us into our next question. Can you speak about some of the historical ways in which youth of color have been unfairly labeled in school-based settings? So we'll start with primary school, middle school, high school, college. So we'll start that discussion.
I can get a little into that. I mean, everyone knows, you know, when it comes to special education, the #1 student, first of all, is African-American males, and they get put in there more for behavior than educational, you know, I guess, behavior issues turn into them getting an IEP versus their education, you know, how smart they are, their intelligences. So I know a lot of times in school, they don't know how to handle boys, shall I say, just boys in general, because they have a lot of energy, because you got to think about how young boys are raised. They're raised with all their activities, all their toys, everything is active from, you know, the time they can think. Everything they do, all their toys are crashing cars, wrestling men, playing sports, this, that, and the other, versus young ladies who having tea parties, playing with dolls. Everything is calm and sitting down. So when you got a young man that goes into preschool and now is forced to sit down for hours at a time without any activity, they're going to be little. So they automatically label them ADHD or things like that. So I think it's just young men in general, but mostly young Black men, when they do it, like we said, the bias is that they're already a bad kid or they're out of control, those types of things. So as soon as they do something, it's times 10 of if another, say a Caucasian or another young man did it, it's elevated, the level is elevated of what they do because of unfair biases of prejudgment from the past or one experience they've had with one young man. So I'm gonna leave it there. I'm gonna let somebody jump in on that.
Well, I agree. And once again, just pointing out that that same unfair bias that leads to, it's the same one across the board that leads to unfair treatment throughout society. Just in education, it's manifested, as Mr. Jones just stated. And that's it. And it comes from that belief that we're inferior and we don't have redeemable qualities, right? We can only understand punishment, pain. We can't understand reconciliation or remorse. They don't. That's part of the belief of the, you know, Black man, and why the treatment is this way. You wouldn't treat someone like that you felt could learn from this situation and could appreciate a bit of tenderness in the approach to them. You don't think they understand that, because this nation has a history of getting us to acquiesce through brute force. To say it as, you know, eloquently as it can be said, but it's like beating our butts until we submit, you know, is what this nation has a history of. And that's, you know, how that's manifested through education, is the suspensions, the detentions, and all those things on all levels.
And just want to give a disclaimer. I have a tendency to ramble on. So if it sounds like I'm reading from a script, I actually am, because I want to make sure that I'm, you know, just considerate of time, you know. But I think I just want to add to that. Just, you know, when you look at just really how Black and brown youth are, you know, products of families who, remember, intentionally marginalized, disenfranchised, segregated, enslaved, and lied to. You know, with that comes systemic and personal trauma. You know, with that trauma comes anger, sadness, health complications, violence, and unease, right? You know, so instead of healing students and creating systems where they can address this trauma, we punish it in schools and further isolate these students from the learning environments and resources needed, you know, to persevere, right? this all leads to, the school to prison pipeline and the heart of how modern day schooling perpetuates systems of racial inequality.
We don't mind you rambling on. You're giving us knowledge, so don't worry about that. Our next question is, how are youth of color often profiled in schools? And we'll mix it on with the next question. What are the potential negative consequences for youth who experience unfair biases in schools?
Go ahead, Jaaye.
Thank you, Lou. But the most negative consequence is that they may start believing what society views of them. That, they look at me like this anyway. And in Los Angeles, that happens a lot as a young man grows up in like the gang bang world. Like they were just your friends in elementary school, middle school, people got into it, high school, people getting shot, and these your friends. Now the people doing the shooting aren't distinguishing between who's from that neighborhood, just grew up there, versus who's from the gang in that neighborhood. So now you get hit or one of your friends get hit and you suffer that trauma and you go to that, well, since they shooting at me anyway, I'ma just join the homies to shoot back. And that's one way it manifests itself in the street. And then the educational system, you start believing you're dumb. You start believing math isn't for you. That's for the Asian kids or the white kids. And that's the worst way I see it manifest itself.
Just piggybacking off of you, man. It's crazy because it's when you think about it, you think about the people in power and how they make decisions from like a prejudice lens, right? Youth of color are stereotyped. They're stereotyped as criminals, savages, and adults, right? Adults and uneducated. So you think about the ways in which they're considered to be deviant, and when you think about that, immediately there's this idea that because of deviant label, they're unable to follow the norms or the structures, or able to abide by the rules and laws of society. So I think when you talk about how students are being profiled in schools, it's just that they're basically, it's almost they're unable to compete, if I can use that. They're unable to compete because of how they're being labeled, how they're being considered, right? And then when you talk about the negative consequences, that's kind of like going off of what Jaaye said, right? Just self-hate, imprisonment, there's a lot of health challenges that stem from that, the mental health instability, struggles with learning, and ultimately not even being able to realize their full potential because of these labels, right? When you accept something that's constantly placed on you, then that ultimately somehow becomes like the expectation, right? Then that expectation, you fulfill that expectation by trying to just meet that expectations, and it just creates a kind of like what the discussion is, right? It creates that unfair bias within yourself, right? Because then you don't really understand a sense of self. Now you're struggling with your identity and who you are, who you want to become. It can definitely be a negative consequence in that way.
And I just want to briefly just highlight when the brother talked about the health consequences. Like, you get high blood pressure from like the stresses of dealing with all the things that we're talking about dealing with. So in addition to mental health, there's actual physical health issues that come from dealing with these unfair biases if you are not able to cope to a certain degree. And that's the best you can do, because the biases are here to stay for quite some time, I'd imagine.
And I'll jump into like another thing, like what we're talking about too. A lot of young men, they're talking about how it leads to mental health, things like that. Like a lot of these young men that live in certain neighborhoods, they have, you know, it's undiagnosed, but they have PTSD. They go through a lot of traumatic incidents growing up that they just got to internalize. They don't get to talk about because, you know, as young Black men, you don't, I don't know about you, young, maybe a little older than Dejan and Jay, but it's like you didn't, as a young man, you didn't really get to express your feelings, and you just always had to be tough and hold it in. As a young Black man, that's how they teach you: just be tough, you know, deal with it. But how do you learn how to deal with stuff when no one teaches you how to deal with it except for saying deal with it? So it's like you go there and then you come to school with all this in you, and it's kind of like sometimes some things happen, so you do have an outburst or things like that because it's the only place that you feel like, because at home you can't let loose or say what you want to say or feel how you want to feel. So this is away from home, and this is what happens. And when a lot of times teachers come, you know, they already got this impression of how you are from on how they visualize you, and then they address you in a certain way of disrespect. So, you know, of course, you say if you want some respect, you got to give it. And if teachers are coming at these young people, you don't know from the time they left your classroom the day before to the time they came back what they have went through, you know. And they come to school, if a kid comes to school and putting his head down on the desk, or they got a mad face, instead of addressing them with get over here and this, that, and, you know, address them with, hey, how you doing? Everything okay? You know, even if they got their head down and that's something you don't allow in your class, a lot of people don't address them in a compassionate way. They just address them with more issues. And then it, you know, it's the outburst. So it's kind of like the unfair bias is like, oh, he mad anyway, but no one takes the time to see why they're upset or why they're angry, things like that. So I think that kind of goes into the unfair bias too, that you're just always angry. Like I said, we don't know what people are going through, and I don't think a lot of people care to try and find out what's going on. And then when you build that relationship with young people, you always notice that schools, certain kids, no matter if they're labeled bad or good, they tend to gravitate towards certain teachers. Those are the ones that listen to them and talk to them in a certain way. It's not even real different. It's just a slight adjustment in how you address the kids and what you're going to get back. So I think that goes into it as well, that instead of thinking of them always angry, find out what's going on with them. And then you'll see that some of these kids are really good kids. And they might have a mad face. They might do that to keep people away from them because they don't want to talk or they don't want to open up because they don't really know how to. And that's something we can start teaching them once we get to that point.
Yeah. And just briefly to Mr. Jones' point, so many of them and us do suffer from PTSD, but I want to be clear, it's rarely post-traumatic stress disorder. It's typically persistent traumatic stress disorder. This post is you were in Iraq. Now Iraq cannot happen over here. It will not happen over here. So what you dealt with in Iraq, it's not going to happen. So that's post-traumatic. The persistent trauma that comes from the way, you know, it comes from the real life circumstances you live in. And those are compounded by the unfair bias that you have to deal with, on top of the fact you got to watch your back walking home. You know, it's like society gives you one thing, the people versus the government, right? The people give you a certain set of traumas and experiences that they don't always have to be traumas. For some people, their life is great. And then the government, which I include the schools in many of those regards. And as a criminal defense attorney, the reason I say that, and any student listening, your teacher is the police when it comes to anything you do wrong. They're the police because they're a mandatory reporter. So if you tell them you did something wrong, they have a duty to report, even if they don't want to. They could lose their job if it's found out somebody later find out you did it and you told this person about it. They could get in trouble. So that makes them the police. And you have a Fifth Amendment right against them not to say anything about what you did wrong. So when they sit you in that room, give you a pen and paper and say, write down what happened, don't do it. Just, you know, we can work it out later, but they charging kids with crimes for, you know, stuff that we talk to the principal about. And that's what that's another part of the unfair bias. Like the stuff we used to just really get detention for, people are getting criminal charges for because they feel we can't, we don't have redeeming qualities. So just wanted to bring that back. I wanted to make sure I know it's kind of off, but put that point in there for any of the students that, don't get yourself in more trouble because the system is after you. So I'm not saying do wrong, but if you do, just don't compound it by, making an attorney not be able to protect you in that situation because you just admitted to it.
And giving a space to somewhat wrap it up, because this is an ongoing conversation that we're going to need to have again. What we do as a community to uplift our youth who experience these biases?
I'm gonna say, I think Jay just said it well. Like, I'm gonna start advising my students when they do something that you have the right to not say anything. Because a lot of times when we do go in there, we give a piece of paper, say, write the statement, write what happened. They put a lot of other stuff that turns into other situations. So that's real good. I think just with that being said, just arming them with more information, giving them more information so they can, more tools, if they're gonna use them or not, just, like to have on their tool belt. May not need it for this job or that job, but just the more information they have, the better. So just enlighten them with real life situations and real life decisions and tools they can use to avoid getting into further trouble or to avoid getting into bad situations, to start with things that can help them move forward and do right, so just, like I said, just more information from my end.
I like to speak directly to parents, or just any guardians or any adults that are enrolling students into schools or whatnot. And I think, just one of the biggest things that you can do as a community is speak up. A lot of times, these policies and, these implementation of rules at the schools are framed in a way so that we don't understand exactly what's going on. So I think, being able to, advocate and ask those questions, right? Ask about the different trainings that, teachers are mandated to go through and suggest some, right? Trauma-informed training. We talk about, a lot of the trauma that stems from the communities in which our young people, live in. And I think it's very important that, given the high volume of trauma that our students experience, it's important that all teachers, staff in these educational institutions are trauma informed, right? And that's something that, can be said when they have town hall meetings, right? When they have these, school site council committees that are public to everyone, right? I think it's important that you go in there and you ask about, how do you handle, infractions, right? Rule breaking situations at school. How do you handle them, right? Are you handling from a more punitive lens? Are you handling from a more, restorative lens, right? Where you're trying to restore relationships, where you're trying to address not only the person who was the victim, but also the person who was the offender, who that whatever they did stemmed from some form of trauma that they experienced maybe at the school or from the community that they live in, right? So, advocate, for students, right? Make sure that these teachers are equipped with the tools needed, so that they are cultural competent, so that they not only see how to problem solve from their lens of where they stem from as their culture addresses it, but also from the culture of the people who they're serving, because that's one of the biggest things as well. And then, like I said, I just, I think it's very important that, we just advocate for our students and, just ask and demand for better, because essentially they're here to take care of, your kids, so you have to ensure that they're doing the best that they can, to support the students' needs.
Absolutely.
And
Go, Jay.
And just on that, what we can do, I think we really have to start telling the children the truth. And what I mean by that is, we're here in the United States of America. This whole country is founded on the Declaration of Independence. That is the first document of this nation that said, hey, we're a nation, this document. And in that document for Black people, they said, you are not human. They didn't say it expressly. They said it in the first line of the second paragraph says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So because the enslaved people did not have liberty and control their lives and were not free to pursue happiness outside the bounds of being happy as a slave, that is this nation saying you are less than a human. And so we have to understand that despite living in a society where every rule, everything is based off of this document. So everything we've built, whether you reform it or not, as long as it's based off this document, it's rooted in a system in which you are less than, and you have to know that, not to be woe is me, but just to understand the situation you're in. And so when you understand that, you'll engage in less battles that are, it's just impossible for you to win in this land, in this way. And that doesn't mean don't try, but understand if people are telling you to stand up and pledge allegiance to the flag that your ancestors were enslaved under and sing a national anthem that talks about the enslavement of your ancestors and be proud of that, they don't have your best interests at heart. And you have to know that and understand that, and despite that, still thrive and survive and think broadly, because maybe the answer isn't on these shores.